Assalamualaikum everyone, and welcome back to your next economics class. And today we have a topic in which we are going to find out the impact of taxes. Before some time ago, we were more capable to understand about the taxes. We learned about its advantages and disadvantages. We learned about that how what different types of taxes are there. And today we are going to find the impact of the taxes on in the market. So in the market, which is obviously clear to all of us, that the market is actually about the buyers and sellers. Whenever they make an exchange, whenever they trade, that is going to be considered as their market. So today we are going to see what is the impact of taxes when especially talking about in the market. So when we are talking about the impact of taxes, we are actually concerned with the indirect taxes first. Now the indirect taxes are the taxes which are imposed on goods and services. All those taxes which are imposed on the goods and services are known as indirect taxes. Now, definitely, this type of taxes, let's suppose we have one example like sales tax or VAT or customs, or let's say tariffs, or let's say excise. These are some of the examples of the indirect taxes. Now, the sales tax is something which we obviously know how it actually is paid. Whenever a buyer buys something, he has to pay some amount of the product. Let's suppose if the price of the product is, let's say, $5, and the government imposes sales tax on the producer, which the producer adds to the consumer's price. So the price of product is 5, and the tax which is imposed is, let's say, rupees 2 or $2. So $2 is the sales tax. So the total price of the product will be $7. So this is how the sales tax is actually paid in the market. You go to any outlet, you go to any of shop or any place where you want to buy something. Usually you are always told to pay some sales tax. Now, this is something very odd that when the buyers are, why the buyers have to pay the sales tax? Since sales tax defines that it's a tax which should be imposed on the sales. The buyer is not selling, he's not making sales, so why he's paying? The true answer is that the producer smartly transfer this sales tax burden on the buyer. So the $7 is actually the retail price, or in other words, it's the consumer's price. So this is how the sales tax is actually put on the consumer. That's why it's sometimes known as indirect taxes, because it's indirectly paid by somebody who is not supposed to pay. So after having a little recap on the indirect taxes, we are going to find out how it impacts on the consumer, or does it always influence, or is it that every time the seller is going to transfer this burden of tax on the consumer? Normally, looking after this example, we can imagine that yes, due to this reason, the sales tax is something which is imposed on the seller but is transferred to the buyer. But it's not always true. It's not true in this sense that we cannot say that all the amount of the tax is always transferred completely on the consumer. It can be completely transferred. It can be partially transferred. The tax burden can be partially transferred, or it can be rather not transferred. Maybe the producer is going to pay the whole amount of tax on him. So what decides that? How we can understand that the tax is going to be imposed on one person and how it is divided? How much burden of the tax is transferred to the consumer? How much the impact of the tax is going to affect the consumer? That is today's our discussion. So what is the answer for this? Like, we are going to see some of the cases over here. We have case 1. The case 1 says that whenever the indirect tax is imposed, an indirect tax like sales tax, so this case shows that the producers, they want 50% to pay, and they want to transfer 50% burden on the consumer. So 50% is the burden of the tax, which the producer says that they are going to pay by themselves. And the 50% they transfer the consumer. We're going to take another case that is going to be known as case 2. That let's suppose if the producer says that they will take burden of, let's say, 30% on them, but on consumer, they are going to transfer 70% of the tax burden on them. Now, this is something which is known as an impact. In this, the impact is shared equally, but in the case 2, we have impact more on the consumer. Like this type of sales tax where the producer is putting more burden on the consumer, but is taking lesser burden on itself. They are taking the lesser impact. How is it possible? How and when the producer is going to take a little burden and put more burden on the consumer? Or let's say in the first case, how is it possible that they are going to share equally? Like 50% they take themselves and 50% by the other. Now, for this, we have only one answer, that how it is going to be decided. And the answer is our very famous and popular concept, that is elasticity. Elasticity is the concept which actually tells us that how much burden of the sales tax or the indirect tax a producer will take on them and how much they will transfer to the consumer. So we are going to discuss the very first case, that is case 1, that the producer is going to take 50% burden on them and 50% on others. So for that, we are going to draw a diagram, and it's only possible that which elasticity it should be. When the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply, I'm abbreviating it PED and PES. If the price elasticity of supply and price elasticity of demand both are equal to 1, which means unity, then it is very much possible that both of them, the producers and the consumers, are going to share the burden. Now let's draft a demand curve. Now this is known as an unit elastic demand curve. since it's not that much flat and it's not that much steeper. And here is our supply curve. So we both agree that both curves are actually a unit elastic curve. So this is a unit elastic supply curve. This is a unit elastic demand curve for demand. So together, this is going to decide the equilibrium first. Let's say this is PQ naught. This is P naught, the original price. And this one is your equilibrium E naught. And let's suppose this is S naught and D naught, the original demand and the original supply. I hope that this diagram is nothing now that different and strange to us. It's quite familiar that this is a diagram of the market equilibrium, and the curves are actually showing the unit elastic of both. Now let's suppose if the tax is imposed, and that is indirect tax. We all know that when the indirect taxes are imposed, it's going to affect the supply curve. And the supply curve is going to shift from S0 to S1. Let me just make it more bold so you could see clearly on your screen. So this is the shift of the supply curve, dear students. Now this is supply S1. When it's shifting from S0 to S1, this is due to the indirect taxes. This shift of supply curve is going to give us a new equilibrium from E0 to E1. So S1 curve is giving an E1 equilibrium point over here, which is going to give us a new price from P0 to P1, which is a raise. And we know when the indirect taxes are imposed, prices are hiking. They are going to increase. But at the same time, the quantity is going to be reduced from Q0 to Q1. Now, let's find out where is the tax area in this diagram. And this is our new topic which we are actually going to learn. To find out the tax area, we need to know that what is actually the area of tax. We see that the supply curve is shifting from S0 to S1. So this whole area which we see over here is actually shifting due to the indirect tax. So this bracket which you see over here represents the tax. So this S0 and S1, between these two curves is the difference between these two curves, or this gap is actually due to the indirect taxes. Now this indirect taxes is cutting this line at 2 points, at E1, which you can see over here, and at this point, let's say T. Let me just recall for you again so you can better understand. This Q1 is now the existing output. You can see that Q1 to point E1 is the new quantity, and this is the price, new price from O to P1. So this new quantity is actually being cut by this tax area, and we can show the tax from area from point E1 to T. So this whole area which you could see over here represent the tax. You can see this bracket over here, tax. This is the same amount which we can show on this output. So on this output Q1, you can see this is the tax area. Now we do have this point over here that shows P1, but we are left with this area, and we are going to join this with this axis, and let's suppose we give it P2. This is just giving a symbol, and this is the total area of tax, dear students. So in this whole diagram, you can see that the area P1, E1, and this point T, and this point P2. So this is the total tax which has been imposed, and it is the total impact of tax. This area is known as the total area of the tax which the government is actually imposing, and it's going to be cut out from the producers and consumers' pocket. All right. Now, the next point is that who is sharing the burden? Is it the same? Yes. If you see the previous price, that was P naught. And we know that if this was the original price, and whatever the price the consumer is paying is above this price, the consumer is now paying the original price, that is P1. So above P naught, the consumer is paying P1 when the tax is imposed from, and it's shifting its supply curve from S0 to S1. Now this is going to increase the price. So from P0 to P1 is the area. If I just shade it this way, this area is going to be known as a consumer paid tax area. Or in other words, you can say that this is the consumer burden area. Let us add something more, like it's the tax on consumer burden area. Now this is the burden which the consumer is going to pay. And if we see the price below the equilibrium, P0 to P2, this area which I'm shading vertically, this is going to be known as the producer's tax burden area. Okay. And you can see from the diagram that both the shaded area are actually the impact of taxes, but one area which I have diagonally shaded this way, this area is actually the consumer's burden area of the tax. And the price below that, which we have derived, is actually the producer tax burden area. So both the areas which you see over here are actually equal. But why it's equal? It's equal just because, like we discussed in the beginning, that when the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply is equal to 1, it's equal to unity, then the both tax area or the impacted or affected tax area is going to be divided among both the consumer and producers equally. So it's showing right now that almost out of this tax area, P1, E1, T, and P2, out of this whole tax area, the half, 50% paid by the consumers, and the 50% is paid by the producers. Now this is one case, dear students. Now we're going to jump on another case which shows where the producers and the consumers, they are not sharing the same burden. Producer is like paying the lesser amount and the consumer is paying a greater amount. How is it possible? So let's see this case as well. Now, in this case, we have to assume that the price elasticity of supply has to be equal to 1. But let's suppose if the price elasticity demand is less than 1, which means it's inelastic. And the price elasticity is unity. In this situation, we can say when the elasticity of demand is getting lower, it's going to put more pressure on the consumers, and the consumers are going to pay more tax burden. Now let's see how it's going to happen. We have that diagram once again on the board showing price on this axis and the quantity on this axis. Now we know that this is a unit supply curve. Let's say it's S0. And now we are going to drop an inelastic demand curve, and we all know that what would be the shape of it. Yes, it's going to be a steeper curve. and the steeper curve has to be somewhere like this shape. Now, this is an inelastic demand curve. Now, this inelastic demand curve and the unit supply curve are going to decide a new price, an equilibrium price, and an equilibrium quantity. The equilibrium quantity is going to be Q naught, and the original price or the first price is going to be P naught. Now, let's suppose if the taxes are imposed, we are all learned that the supply curve is going to shift to the left side. This is going to give us supply curve S1, and the equilibrium, which was E naught previously, is going to be now E1, just like we did in the previous diagram. And this is going to determine the new price for the consumer, that is going to be P1. And the quantity is going to reduce from Q naught to Q1. Now, we all know that this is the whole representing the tax, the gap between S1 curve and S naught. It's all because of the tax. And now the existing quantity is Q1. So this Q1 at E1, which is the quantity, is actually cut by the tax or indirect tax from this point to this point. Careful, students. You have to find out it. And this point, we name it as, let's say, with the letter T. And we are going to put this point right over here next to the price axis. And this is going to give us a new price, that is P2. So there you go. Now you can see that the price moving above P naught to P1 is, this area is going to be for, yes, the consumer burden tax area. And the area which is below P naught, from P naught to P2, is going to be for the producer's tax burden. Now we can shade just like we did it before. So this vertical shaded area is showing the producers, and this diagonally vertical is actually the tax burden for the consumer. And what is the total tax? It's P1 E1 and P2 and T. So this whole area, which I am now highlighting it again, this is the total tax area which the government is going to earn. And out of this total tax area, the price above the equilibrium, the price from above the original price, that is P naught, that is going to be paid by the consumer now. And that consumer is going to be considered as the consumer burden. And the one which is below the original price is going to be paid by the producer. Now, what's the difference you see over here? That in this diagram, the producer is paying the lesser amount of tax, and the consumer is paying a greater amount. If you just see it and compare it with case 2, don't you think that it reflects it? The producer is paying like 30%, and the consumer is paying 70% out of 100. So that reflects to the case 2. That means that when the elasticity value is reducing, the more the burden is falling on the consumer. We can take many more cases, like this is only case 1 and 2 which we had derived. If we try this with case 3, 4, and 5. So case 3 is going to be with when the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1, which means if it is elastic. And let's suppose if the price elasticity of demand is equal to 0, and last is if the price elasticity of demand is equal to infinity. If the demand is changing its position depending upon its elasticity, that is going to be something which makes you to explain that how the impact of tax is going to create more burden on which part of the market. Is it going to be on the consumer or is it going to be on the producers? Right? Now, if we just take the case 3 quickly, when the demand curve is elastic, how would this work? Now, this is the supply curve again, S naught, and now we know that if we have an elastic demand curve like this, with the value is greater than 1, it can be any value 2, 3, or any other, but we know that the elastic curve is usually a flatter demand curve. So let's suppose if this is the flatter demand curve, this is demand D naught. So if this is the quantity which we get, and this is the equilibrium, original equilibrium, and this is the price which we gain as P naught. Now, when the tax is going to be imposed, this is going to reduce the supply from S naught to S1, as we already been on board on this. So the new equilibrium is going to be E1, and the new price is going to be P1. The quantity is going to reduce from Q0 to Q1. And now, when it's about the time to talk about the taxes, so this whole tax is actually cutting this output, the new output, from point E to point T. It's all the same which we are doing. I'm keep repeating it so you could better understand it in. So this T is going to be joined on this axis of the price, giving us the point, another price P2. Now, this is not the equilibrium price, remember that. This is the price just to define that what is the total amount of tax. And we can see this is the total amount of tax, and this is the output, and the total tax is cutting from point E1 to point T. Now, what do you see in this diagram? That this is the area of producer's burden. And this diagonal area is for the consumers. So what do you see in this diagram? We see that the consumer's burden is lesser than the producers. So it means that when the value of elasticity is increasing, or let's say if it's turning elastic, that is definitely very much clear that in that shape, the producers are going to pay more taxes. They are going to bear more burden of tax on them, and they are going to transfer a little tax on the consumer. So let's illustrate one very small example over here, dear students, that how it really happens in the real world. Now, just imagine if the demand is elastic. We know that one of the reasons for being elastic demand curve is when there are close substitute. Did we remember that? If any product which has a close substitute, dear students, what happens? Its demand turns into elastic. So when it's elastic, it means that if one producer increases its price, you see a great change in reduce in its demand. Now what happens? Just imagine how the tax burden is going to be lesser transferred to the consumer. The best example is whenever you see the competition among producers or the sellers, if any tax is imposed, we can see that sometimes the producer are not transferring its tax burden more on its consumer. Like there has been a time that some of the telecom companies in Pakistan, they were giving a balance of 100 rupees for 100 rupees balance to every consumer. But some were charging a little tax, let's say 15% deduction, something like that. So what happened that some firms, when they wanted to increase their number of buyers, what they did at that time, they actually took all the burden to themselves. They didn't transfer to the consumers. Why? Because they were in the competition. And at that time, what they have to do, that they find that the elastic demand, their product demand is elastic, if they are going to put the pressure on the consumer, if they are going to transfer the burden of tax on them, then they might lose some of the. So isn't it very nice that they should take this burden on themselves and let the consumers enjoy? So what happens that these elasticity concept and transferring the burden of the tax is sometimes helpful for some firms to take some appropriate decisions. Okay, so I'm leaving the last two cases, that is price elasticity of demand is equal to 0, and if it is perfectly elastic. So this is going to be left for your homework assignment. So summing up today's lesson, what we have learned today is about the impact of taxes, dear students. The impact of taxes is something which shows that how the government puts the tax, especially the indirect taxes on its in the market, on the seller, and how the seller smartly can transfer it to the consumer. And it all depends upon the concept of elasticity. If the elasticity is lower in its value, which means it's inelastic, then they are more capable to transfer the burden on consumers. But if their elasticity, their product's elasticity is elastic, that means that they are not in a position to transfer more burden on them. Rather, they have to pay more burden or bear more burden themselves. Okay, so that's it for today's topic. So we're going to find another new topic in our next class. So you have a good day and see you in the next class. Allah Hafiz.